Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Ireland is known across the world for a love of potatoes and also for the huge impact the potato famine had on the country's population and national psyche. Potato blight was one of the main causes of the famine and is still problematic today. The national potato production is now largely grown by a few hundred specialist growers, but the problem of potato blight is ever present in their management of the crop. A grower typically needs to invest close to €13,000 per hectare to grow each hectare of potatoes. The financial risks are huge, but the grower will try to ensure these risks are minimised in order to maximise returns. On the other side of the equation, there is significant pressure to reduce the use of chemical fungicides used on potato crops. The cost of these fungicides are quite significant, and growers will welcome any tool which will help to minimise fungicide use, but while also protecting the potato crop. Today I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Kildea, a researcher in Teagasc, and Klara Finkele, Head of Agricultural Meteorology at Met Éireann, to discuss how potato blight forecasting has developed over the past number of years and how it can help farmers in 2022. Klara, I first want to ask you about what sort of services Met Éireann supply to the industry in general.
Met Éireann's mission is to monitor, analyse and predict the weather and climate and provide a range of high quality meteorological related information. So that includes the public as well as any industry that has a need for any weather related information. And we have, of course, our public website. We also have a commercial website that when we deliver large data sets to paid customers, specialized customers, they can do that via our specific website. We have, of course, the radio and the national media, as well as local media. Any of the local radio stations get our forecasts, a tailored forecast for their area. And then there's a telephone consultancy service for specific industries like the film industry. We have an awful lot of requests from them, or the racing board, horse racing board, have a large consultancy with us. And then there's the gritting for road ice, so the safety aspect. So there is quite a lot. And for instance, Teagasc grass growth modeling output and the measurements from LOD's model is displayed on the RTE Sunday farming forecast on RTE. So there's a wealth of information and different platforms like the websites, the traditional radio, the television, Twitter, and so on.
And Klara, you obviously, and we'll get into this a little bit later on in terms of the work that Met Éireann and Teagasc are jointly doing together around blight, because that's kind of why we're here. But is there any other work that you were doing with industry specifically, where you're kind of working jointly with them in terms of research projects and developing models or developing specific data sets that is of particular relevance to that industry?
There's a huge wealth of collaborations. For instance, in terms of international, the IPCC report, we then look at what that means for Ireland nationally. So we translate that a bit. And there is a large project called Translate that produces climate scenarios specifically for Ireland and standardizes. So that's one. And then, of course, with the EPA, we work on different projects on, for instance, atmospheric dispersion. That is to do with foot and mouth, airborne dispersion, foot and mouth disease. Also, blue tongue has an airborne component. And there is also radio protection, like if we have a radiological accident. And then the moment we have a service for Ukraine, if there's any radioactive accident or incident in the Ukraine, what does that mean for us in Ireland? So yes, there is, and with DAFM, we have Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, we have projects on the forest fire risk. They're the issuing authority on the fire danger notices, but we provide them with the meteorological input and we run a fire weather index model for them. And then we provide also the AgMed unit within the research division provides DAFM with a nematode iris report in the spring, which we just issued, and then in the autumn, liver fluke. So there's a wealth of different aspects.
Okay. So what we see in the TV, I suppose, and a bit on the on your website, which is all very good. It's probably just the tip of the iceberg, and you're from what I'm hearing from you, you're very much Namurd and Teagasc is very much a science-based organization. It all hinges around that.
Yes, and I didn't even go into any of the projects in terms of the numerical weather prediction. There is a wealth of information there, and we just joined some European colleagues to combined our models together for over a large area, and then combine computer resources, because each individual country can't afford such big computers anymore. So there's like 4 or 5 of these countries combined to a weather center, and we run them together.
I do remember that. I think that made the news about 6 months ago. Where
yes,
you were
exactly. UW West it's called. Yes.
Yes, I do. Yeah. Stephen, can I just bring you in there, because we're really here to talk about potatoes and talk about potato blight and the interaction between Teagasc Research and Met Éireann, and as regards how the predictions are going. But maybe just before we start, just maybe for some of the listeners who mightn't be as familiar with potatoes, what's the level of potatoes grown in the country now, and what sort of yields are farmers producing now?
I suppose at the moment we're probably just under 10,000 hectares every year of potatoes. And they're given, I suppose, just under 400,000 tons. So there's quite a good yield. They're yielding quite well, just, I suppose, between 40 and 50 tons in most commercial crops. Of course, it's going to depend on the type of variety and things like that. But definitely there's, I suppose, a small area of it, but they're quite intensive in producing good crops.
And as you say, it is a much smaller area now than it was maybe 100 years ago. But has that been partially offset, or maybe totally offset, by the increase in yields? Where were the yields 100 years ago in comparison to today?
Oh, there would have been a fraction of what we would be getting now. Being honest, you could be 10 to 15 ton if you're lucky. Being honest, it partly, I suppose, 100 years ago, we probably were eating a bit more potatoes, probably a bit more of the diet, being honest. But definitely the production in terms of how we produce them and the yields that we get, and the change of variety, of course, higher yielding varieties have had a big impact on offsetting the area that is under potatoes. Okay,
and obviously the association with potatoes and blight is quite big. Is it as much a problem today, Stephen, as it would have been? You know, we can all go back to the famine times, I suppose, but even 100 years ago when we maybe got on top of it a little bit more. But is it still very, very problematic?
As a disease itself, it is as problematic, and you might even argue that the strains of blight, and we might get into that in a few minutes, the strains of blight that are here at the moment are actually more aggressive than they were 100 years ago or 170 or 75 odd years ago. How we manage it and how we control it is different, and that is, I suppose, that has taken a lot of the pressure off blight as a major problem. But as a disease itself, it's as problematic, if not more.
And in terms of that being problematic, Stephen, in terms of yield penalty, is it, obviously, again, you go back to the famine again and go back to that one, but they had black nothing basically when blight came in. Would it be the same today?
If we left potatoes untreated in the wrong season, we would have no marketable yield. I think the one year where, in the trials perspective, that stands out is 2012, where we had zero marketable yield. We had tubers, but they were like marbles.
And how come then the varieties and variety breeding and all that end of it, that we haven't managed to, I suppose, breeding resistance to the blight?
This is a very sort of a difficult one, because we can breed resistance to blight, and there are varieties that are very good against it. I suppose when we look at the market and we look at the varieties that are there, they're dominated by varieties that are quite susceptible. Now, we have to look at other traits in terms of those potatoes that we are consuming. And unfortunately, at the moment, we're probably not reaching the quality and things like that in terms of varieties that have that resistance. The potential is definitely there, but I think it's where the market is. We have to bring the market or those varieties to the market and make sure that we're able to sell them. It is a case of a farmer isn't going to grow a variety of potatoes if they cannot sell it.
So I suppose what you're talking about there is that the variety needs to look pretty, and the right color and the right shape and the right density and the right dry matter, and put them all together is pretty tricky.
These are from the breeder's perspective, these are major traits. Basically, you put a variety into a store, you want to be able to take the exact same variety out and exactly those same traits that you say of. So blight is only one component of what the breeders are looking for. And of course, if we can control blight in other means, then a lot of major emphasis will go on those other traits.
Okay, so what you're saying then really is blight is problematic, disease resistance isn't wonderful. So I presume then farmers are forced to protect their crops each year.
Unfortunately, that is the case, and it is a case that we could have 15 to maybe 20 applications of a fungicide on a potato crop in any given year. Of course, the big thing is it's all going to depend on the weather, and that's really what drives potato blight. So if we have potatoes going into the ground, I suppose over the last month, they'll be starting to emerge around this time. And of course, look, if there is blight around and the conditions are favorable to it, farmers will have to protect those crops. And that means protecting from this stage through to harvest. And that is a long time.
Blight, I suppose, is kind of to a degree like the COVID virus a little bit. It's a bit of an arms race kind of thing. It keeps changing, keeps moving, it's a moving target, if you like, to try and control that. And there are a lot of strains, I believe, on that. Where are the strains currently? Are they really problematic at the moment, or how is it shaking out at the moment?
Indeed, look, blight is, I suppose, when we talk about blight, Phytophthora infestans is the pathogen itself, and it tends to be what we say clonal. So it tends to be really related to itself in terms of there might be a small number of different strains throughout the country. Similar to the COVID, as you described, we had our Delta, we have our Omicron. In blight, there's a sort of a naming scheme would be put on it. It's called EU 837 or so like this in terms of the different genotypes. Where we're at the moment, we're almost at a sort of a point where we're seeing a displacement of the population again. We saw displacement maybe 12 years ago, and we had some major impacts where we had what was coming through called the strains called Blue 13 and Pink 6. They had a big impact into how we actually control blight. And now we're also seeing around in the last couple of years, we're starting to see another shift or another change in the population. And one of those is having a big impact, a strain called 37A2, EU 37A2, and that has resistance to fluazinam. So that is having a big impact in terms of how farmers are going to control their crops into the future.
And Stephen, does it really matter necessarily in terms of which one is out there? They're all hard to control one way or the other. And do we need to predict what's out there or how infectious they're going to be?
It's really important that actually we I suppose are able to predict it and have some idea that is out there. I think the best example is that sort of Blue 13 that arose in 2008. Before that, we had quite a stable population, and we had grown, I suppose, accustomed to it. So we were able to manage it. We sort of knew what its strengths were. We knew where its weaknesses were. We knew what temperatures, I suppose, was ideal for it, etc. So we had built up sort of a bank of information that we were able to, I suppose, tackle it in a certain way. All of a sudden, a new strain comes in, and it could sort of upset those balances. And in the case of Blue 13, it had fluazinam, or not fluazinam, it had metalaxyl resistance. So straight away, we had to play a bit of catch up there. So being able to predict it and being able to predict the disease is vitally important.
Carla, can I bring you back in here now? Because I think this is certainly where Met Éireann, we're trying to feed into the system. In terms of the late blight forecasting system that was in place up till now, you might maybe go back a little bit in history, and you might maybe describe to us the origins of that and how the system was operating all the way up to today.
Yes, it goes back to Austin Burke in the 1950s, where he, through some small data amounts, came up with this relationship of the relative humidity above 90% and temperature above 10 degrees and the sporulation of 12 hours, that then we would get into a situation where there could be blight after having 12 hours, another 12 hours of effective blight hours, and then the risk increases. And that's when Met Éireann issues blight warnings. And that's how it's been since 1953. So it hasn't changed then until a couple of years ago with Teagasc. We had this PhD project on developing and looking at temperature and relative humidity and weather data if the potatoes have changed. So we now have implemented in Met Éireann these updated rules from the outcome of the research at Teagasc with the field trials.
Stephen, as Klara mentioned there, you've been working with Met Éireann in terms of trying to, I suppose, make the tools a bit more specific in terms of the blight forecasting. Is that related to a specific project, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so this came about actually as part of the Department of Agriculture funded project called EPIC, establishing a platform for integrated pest management in Ireland. And I suppose we decided that we'd look at a number of, I suppose, sort of possible sort of decision supports or risk prediction models and see, could we bring them up to speed and almost use them as a framework for other future models. And of course, look, late blight is the one that stood out. And we had a model, as Klara sort of said, from the 1950s. We've seen major changes in production and of course the changes in the population. And I suppose it was a valid question to ask, how relevant is that model currently? So as part of the project with Met Éireann and Minute, we had a PhD student basically taking some of the data from Teagasc in terms of outbreak of diseases, but also then some of the detailed weather data that we have on site. And it was a case of actually, look, rerunning the models, teasing it out, seeing could we, I suppose, does subtle changes in the forecast, can it predict better? And there was some subtle changes that could actually be made to it. One, of course, was the relative humidity, a slight reduction in relative humidity, but also then in the accumulation of the effective blight hours and in changing what previously was just relatively rainfall to also include relative humidity, because we know that it isn't always the case that you need to have rainfall to have actually some level of dampness in the crop. So we included relative humidity in that aspect. And these subtle changes did have a big impact in terms of, I suppose, the amount of predictions that would come true, or amount of warnings that would come true. But I think when we look back at the original sort of forecast, it was extremely conservative. It was highlighting really, really high pressure sort of situations, but there would have been quite a few sort of periods where it probably missed times where you might actually regard, well, actually this feels a bit blighty, if you know what I mean. And that's probably a reflection, it's probably a reflection on the time where actually we didn't have a huge amount of tools to combat blight. So you really wanted to get those absolute sort of periods that were really going to be important. Now we know we're in a different sort of scenario. The cost that is associated with blight and the risk that is associated is much greater, and therefore we probably need some more warnings and try to identify a bit more of the periods that are actually going to be conducive to blight, even if it's, I suppose, maybe not that huge, big, massive blight sort of weather. And that's important from a commercial grower sort of perspective.
And Stephen, did that include quite a few field trials over years in different locations, or how can we be confident, I suppose, that if I'm a grower and I'm after spending, geez, I don't know what it is today, it's well over 10,000 euros a hectare on putting in potatoes, so it's a huge risk, that what we are talking about here will work?
Absolutely. So the work was conducted on, I suppose, the data from the breeding program, the outbreaks of the blight, and also then the weather data. But alongside that, we did conduct a number of field trials where we looked at a number of factors. Actually, it wasn't just the blight prediction, but we also included varietal resistance and change in dose depending on the level of blight sort of risk that was there. So we have some good data. We've generated some very good data to say that actually, look, there is we can sort of predict better in terms of that sort of risk period, or forecast better in terms of the risk period it is there. What I would say is that at the moment, look, we're sort of saying, okay, get familiar with this. It's not a complete sort of system to sort of take away from, look, having knowledge where your field is, where the risk is, what variety and things like this. But it will provide information on terms of, look, what the weather is like. Is it going to be conducive to blight? And also what is coming through in terms of the forecast is that previously it would have been just that warning, it is blight risk is there. It's also providing now an idea level of that risk. And of course, look, where there's absolutely no risk, where it's zero effective blight hours, it is going to be quite low. But it is going to be then a case that as I suppose farmers become more familiar with it, they will actually start to see, I suppose, what's relevant for them in terms of whether it's changing dose or maybe prolonging a spray interval or things like this.
So Klara, can I bring you back there? So with all the information that Stephen and his PhD student came up with, how have Met Éireann plugged that into their existing system to take account of all those the changes, I suppose?
What we actually produce now is a website with the output from our numerical weather prediction model, and apply the blight model to that input data from the numerical weather prediction model. So you actually on the website have a 6-day forecast for a number of locations, and you can see what the prediction for rainfall is and the relative humidity and the temperature, these 3 controlling factors for blight. And then there's also a spatial map that gives you an idea how, but this is model data. So this is not observation data. This is model data forward into time, like on day 3, 4, and 5, for the farmers to see where are the risky areas. Because blighty weather is a warm front. So a warm front comes through, and it depends on how long it stays before the associated cold front comes along and then clears out with fresher, cooler, drier conditions. So how long does it stay? In the past, from my own experience as a forecaster, often you would say there's blight conditions from, say, Monday to Thursday, but then the warm front stalls and then it stays around for much longer. So then it kind of like you have to watch it. And that give the new products on our external website will give the farmers direct access to be able to watch that on day 3, 4, and 5, as well as specific locations like on 3-hourly intervals. So they can actually see the progression of the warm front themselves. Because the other thing is with the numerical weather prediction, and the 6-day forecast that's there is based on a deterministic run. There's also something called the ensemble, and Met Éireann now produce rainfall risk maps, so the probability of rainfall. And that is what we'll aim to do, say for next year or the year after, to actually have a risk map based on not just one forecast, but on those 51 ensemble runs of ECMWF, that we can give a more accurate assessment of the risk. Because the risk of potato blight at this moment is based on one model simulation. So the next step forward would be to use more input data to see the breadth of, say, relative humidity, because it's a threshold. If it's above 88, it's blight. If it's slightly below that, and the models can be slightly out in timing or in the relative humidity. So to take that risk, the risk of the meteorological data into account as well. So that's going to be the next project.
Okay. So if maybe I have a completely wrong end of the stick here, but in terms of the modeling that's done to predict what's going on in the future, does that take into account what's happened in the past and how that's kind of developed, if you like, in the past to project forward into the future? And I suppose really my question is, if I'm correct in saying that, is that general in terms of the general data that you would get from a number of different stations, or is that more specific and local, so you come up with that general prediction on a more local basis?
Okay, there's 2 levels here. What you're talking about, I think what you're aiming at is the numerical weather predictions. Like, how do we come up with a prediction for rain, wind, temperature, the basic meteorological aspects? And then we apply the new potato blight model and then give you a deterministic, like a determined risk of potato blight. Now, in terms of the meteorological data, yes, that is very much, there is all the data from around the world, satellite, ascents, aircraft data, surface data, ocean data, gets all put together and assimilated to give you the correct initial conditions and then a forward prediction. So yes, everything is based on observations at some stage, and then that gets then run with a computer model forward in time.
Okay, I can see why you need the very big computer, in fairness.
Yes, you do. Well, it's actually in Holland and in Iceland, I think.
Okay. Stephen, can I come back to you just for a second in terms of, so if I'm let's just say a potato grower in Meath, and I'm on a routine of applying the blight protection to my crops maybe once a week, as would normally be the case, but looking at the new weather prediction, it's kind of telling me that, look, there's really no blight in the forecast all the way out for 5 or 6 days past when I'm due to go back and apply that blight protection spray again. Is that kind of how does the grower view that, or how does the grower practically use this information?
I suppose there's two things, Michael. The first is that this is not going to tell the grower if there's blight in the crop. So they will have to go out and monitor that. And things will change based on, look, if there's blight there, then you're going to be a scenario where you can't sort of take the risk and not spraying. So it's more about giving information and allowing them to help them make decisions, I should say. So it's a case on, for the moment, what I would be saying, look, for growers to get familiar with it, to see what's there. Would I be changing immediately from that strategy of going maybe from that 7-day where they're on a 7-day sort of spray regime? At the moment, I wouldn't. But what I would say is, keep an eye on it, look on it, get familiar with it, because it's going to be about a learning for them to actually be familiar and sort of say, look, yeah, clearly there was very low risk predicted, and I can clearly see that low risk occurred. And over time, as they build up that confidence, it will be a case of actually then, look, how do we approach it? The sort of the website itself and what Met Éireann are providing, it won't say to reduce, or it won't say to stretch an interval, but this is where we would be looking at it and sort of saying, okay, if there's a really low prediction of blight, you've no blight in your field, then is a case actually, look, can you either reduce what you're putting on in terms of fungicide at that application, or can you stretch that interval? And that's really going to come down, I suppose, to the aspect of the grower in terms of their system, but also then the location or the amount of blight that might be in that area.
Okay, I suppose it does come down to, we are on a path, I suppose, of reducing pesticides, or I suppose the need to reduce pesticides over time. I suppose for two reasons: one from legislation, but also from the point of view of consumer sentiment. I suppose would like less. And would you see this as playing a role or a part in that?
Absolutely. Look, this is what the whole project, the EPIC project, was set out to do. It was integrated pest management, and we're using information to control that disease in the most effective manner that we can. And if it's a case, look, it may be a case that over the summer months, over the potato growing season, that actually it is all high risk. And in that scenario, the applications that are going to be applied are going to be justified. But if it's a case where actually, look, an example might be 2018 or early 2020, where actually we had periods of really low risk, couple of weeks of really low risk, then the scenario would be there that actually, look, the number of applications or the amount of fungicide that would have been applied could have been reduced. And I think that's where this would provide the confidence for that actually to occur.
Klara, just in terms of the prediction, your prediction is, instead of kind of being more a national one, and now it's kind of a very local one, pushing it out over 3 or 4, maybe even 6 days. How about a farmer, though, where a farmer in, say, I don't know, a locality in Tipperary, but he's in a sheltered field, and that's where the crops are growing, and it's maybe potentially more prone to blight? How does the model, or can the model account for that at all?
Well, the model is based on a 9-kilometer gridded data. So every 9 kilometers, we have a grid point. So we can't really go down to field scale or like the sheltered field. That is really down to the farmer to know what their specific location is like. But there is this general overview over the country that give you the idea of where the warm front actually sits, because it comes back to a warm front, like as you said yourself, it feels a bit blighty. And that's basically a warm front coming in. Where does it stall? Where does it go? Does it hang around? Is it slow? Is it slower? Is it faster? So that is usually a fairly widespread phenomena. It's not like a local thing. A warm front comes across.
And in terms of that 9-kilometer grid that you talked about there, is that to do with the resolution that you have, or is that to do with, we have a local weather station there, and that's feeding in information about the humidity and all the bits and pieces, and we can track that, and it's giving us a much better prediction?
Now, this is based on the model. That is the grid the model is on. So all the data, the surface data you're thinking of, that gets assimilated into the initial conditions for this global weather model to run forward in time. And then that runs on roughly a 9-kilometer grid at the moment. But these resolutions are constantly improving, and there is talk of going to 5 kilometers. And so, yeah, And our own in-house model runs at 2.5 kilometers at the moment, but it only runs out to 3 days. So for potato blight, you really need 3 days and 3 to 6 days, because that gives you that outlook in terms of maybe changing the applications, the timing or the amount. So we do need for blight that 2-day lead time, and then see what the worm front does in 3, 4, 5 days time.
Okay. I suppose not every disease is necessarily as destructive, I suppose, as blight, but can you see, Klara, any other future developments where you will be able to help farmers in terms of disease forecasting?
Well, I was actually talking to Stephen about septoria and maybe rust or whatever. I rely on Teagasc. And in fact, Teagasc and Met Éireann have started this year a joint research working group to tease out these problems or these projects, because Teagasc are the experts on the farm activities and Met Éireann are the experts on the weather. So combining the two is really the fruitful collaboration we have. So yes, a lot of the diseases are based on weather and similar, moist, warmish conditions.
So, Stephen, Klara has given you a blank canvas there. So, what diseases are you going to look at first to make sure that we can actually get on top of those?
Yeah, well, actually, one thing that we are doing, another Department of Agriculture project that Teagasc are involved in, that has been led by UCD, is looking at mycotoxin contamination in, I suppose, cereal crops, and those mycotoxins are driven by Fusarium, and of course, Fusarium is a wet weather disease of the grains or the ears, and generally occurs around flowering. So, if we were able to predict, I suppose, the factors that lead to Fusarium, hopefully we would be able to reduce the amount of mycotoxins, because we could target sort of control measures specific to those. Of course, it's not just weather, it's the whole interaction of the crop, its environment, the agronomy and things like this. But as Klara said, these all need weather. These all tend to be wet weather diseases. So look, the Fusarium is one that is the project has kicked off this year. But of course, look, ideally we'd like to be looking at a lot more into the future. And look, our big problems, as Klara said, is something like septoria in wheat, and then of course ramulari in barley, and things like this. So if we are to achieve the goals, I suppose, set out in terms of pesticide reduction, this is actually going to be a key component, being able to predict the disease, because look, we do need to be able to manage it if disease is going to develop, but likewise, if it's not going to develop, then we don't need to be applying pesticides.
I suppose building into what you've already said, Stephen, in terms of integrated pest management and having decision support systems to support the reasons why we don't, or maybe even do, apply a plant protection product.
Absolutely.
Stephen, thank you very much for your time, and Klara as well, thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you back again shortly to talk about another project that has a successful outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. Thanks.
So that's all we've time for. My thanks to Stephen and Klara for joining me on the podcast today. And finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.